I'll never forget the day I read a book. It was contagious, 70 pages. There were pictures here and there, so it wasn't hard to bear. The day I read a book.
Well, hello everybody again to the May session of the Wafer-Thin Books Club, and thank you for joining us. This month we're going to be discussing Snow Country by, depending on which way you look at it, if you want to be strictly correct in Japanese, you would say Kawabata Yasunari, but we'll say all the English language things put him as Yasunari Kawabata, Japan's first Nobel Prize winner. And interestingly enough, I think he won in 1967. I may be off by a year. At the time he did that, he won, literally none of his books had been translated into Swedish. And even then he had only like this book and two others had been translated into English. So it was interesting. I mean, of course, the Nobel Prize Committee often picks an odd, choice, not to say he's an odd choice, but, it was an unlikely choice simply given how obscure he was for most of the dominant, literature languages outside of Japanese. So James, this was your choice. So I'm going to put you on the hot spot and explain your justification. But before that, let's talk about what folks have been reading. So James, what's been good for you this month?
Well, I've actually cunningly not brought either of them here, but they're probably the two best short books I read this month. One was actually inspired by Gordon last month, End of the Morning by Charmian, Clift, which I just finished last night, which, I thought was tremendous. I mean, it's as Gordon was saying, it's an unfinished book, but it pretty much stands on its own as a novella. At the end, it sort of opens out. You can see that it was opening out to being a story about other things. So I've got Mr. Eyebrows here, this is Mitchell, who wants to be involved. It's just a tremendous piece of writing. It reminded me actually of sort of a more working class version of another unfinished book, Katherine Mansfield's The Aloe, which again was sort of about quite a complicated family living by the sea, and the kind of competition between the children, and it just had that very similar sort of vibe to it. But I loved it, and yes, I really wish it had been finished. But yes, as Gordon was saying, she spent most of her life really subservient to her husband, George Johnson's writing, and just never got a chance to finish this. And then she was sort of working on it off and on, got a bit stuck, and then she died suddenly, and so it never happened. But it's a shame because it's a lovely book. But then if it had been finished, it probably would have been far too long to be talked about today. So, and the other book I read that I thought was really good was Simone. I'm never going to pronounce her surname right. I'm never sure if it's Weil or Weil. On the abolition of all political parties, which was pretty much impossible to argue with in any point. The only bit I didn't entirely agree with, she talks a bit about Rousseau and some of his assumptions about human nature, which I think are a bit off. But other than that, you can't really criticize anything she has to say. And in fact, it's probably a book that's more apt now even than when it was written, which is a fairly depressing thought. But yes, So a couple of really good ones there. Sorry, dogs everywhere.
You can always count on Val to have a moderate view of things.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say that given what her fate was, but anyway.
But no, it's right. It's actually interesting because it's an essay, quite a slender essay, and it's published. This is the edition that was translated by Simon Lees, the French, then Australian writer. Okay. And yes, it's bulked up to being more sort of full book size with writings by him and by Czesław Milosz.
Okay.
And all very interesting. You can see Milosz writing about how he both is fascinated by, not entirely in agreement with, but could not resist Weil's arguments, and it's just, yeah, a really nice little collection of work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm gonna do I actually two of the ones I wanted to mention, I don't have anything to show myself because I read them off the Internet Archive. One of them I mentioned in the post that I put up last weekend about disaster novels in England, and it's called The Time of the Crack, which was Emma Tennant's second novel, very influenced by J.G. Ballard and Michael Moorcock, because it's sort of effort. So essentially, a great crack opens up in the Thames, and which is the precursor to England falling apart. Um, and everyone runs amok in one way or another. And what's interesting is that they quickly get a myth of what's on the other side of the Thames, that life is better on the other side of the Thames. It's not chaotic. And so the remaining capitalists quickly build a private army and start capturing people to create a labor force to build a bridge across the crack to go to the other side where they're going to be able to establish their great, capitalist domains again, and et cetera, et cetera. So it was just a lot of fun. You could see she apparently her first novel she wrote as a under a pseudonym, and it was put up for an award, and Alberto Moravia, the Italian novelist, held it up as an example of like, this is how ridiculous English literature is these days. And it kind of had put her off writing for about 5 years until seeing the kind of crazy stuff that English science fiction was into in the late 60s kind of encouraged her to start experimenting again. So that she looks like I mean, I didn't realize she had written as much as she has, and a lot of interesting stuff. So she has like a female Ripper book. She has she's done a lot of playing around with fictional themes. So I actually have a few of hers stacked up on the to be read list. The other one I just finished a couple of days ago and posted about, called The Finishing Tusk by Brigid Brophy, which is absolutely hysterical. It's about two lesbians who are running this very elite, sort of very elite finishing school for kind of the cast-off daughters of the the internet, the jet set, if you will. So like an African president's daughter, et cetera, and then an English princess. So one of the, in effect, like Queen Elizabeth's daughter is sent to the school, and they're all horrified because she's a very sporty, homely girl, and particularly one of the schoolmistresses is like a predatory lesbian who's effectively grooming the right beautiful young girls to be seduced in one way or another. And then there's this hardy, ugly, sporty girl who comes and just messes up the whole thing. It's apparently Brophy wrote it as sort of a pastiche on Ronald Furbank's novels. So the prose and the dialogue is very convoluted and kind of baroque, and that's part of the fun, is that you can see her just having one, and it's super short. It's only like 110 pages long. Great fun stuff. The other one I wanted to mention, which I've been keeping a secret for, because I read these in March. This is three novels by a woman named Verity Bargate, a British novelist. Her first one was called No Mama No, and her second was Children Crossing, and the third is called Tit for Tat. And I didn't talk about these because I actually contacted her sons. She died of cancer in the mid 80s, I want to say. And her books have been out of print forever. And so I approached her sons and their agency, the agency who handles her estate, about getting the rights for recovered books. and let's just say they want a whole lot more money. And interestingly enough, because I kind of keep in touch with some of the other people doing republished or doing recovered reissues kind of publishing stuff. So I contacted a couple of other people who were doing it, saying, hey, I bombed out, but maybe you want to give a shot. And they both said, oh yeah, we read her stuff and it wasn't good enough in their opinion. I thought it was terrific. So each one of the, I mean, they're all really quite short. So 120 pages, in most cases, 130 pages. So and the spoiler alert, I'm going to give you spoilers here. And if you are a spoiler prone person, I don't know why people get hung up about spoilers myself, because like, if it's well written, what does it matter? But anyway, so No Mama No, it's a postnatal depression kind of story. So the mother has her second son, and she simply cannot bond with the child, and she's feeling horrible with herself. And a friend of hers reaches out and says, oh, I'm back in England, I'm in Brighton, why don't you come down with the kids and spend the day? And she does. And as she's on the train going to Brighton, she goes into the WC and changes both of the boys into girls' clothing, and then passes the kids off as girls every time she spends time with this friend. And so, I mean, that's the kind of the twist that goes on here. And then there's the husband's reaction is, let's say, not balanced when he finally finds out what's going on. Children Crossing is very kind of tragic. It's essentially two kids are killed in a tragic car accident. But again, she has these kind of twists. So the woman is already sort of distanced from her husband. And so she actually does not tell him that the children are dead for some amount of time as sort of a revenge thing. But the most extreme, Tit for Tat, is about a woman who she meets a wonderful guy. They start living together. They get married, and then she becomes convinced he's having an affair, and he's lost interest. And so she arranges to have an unnecessary mastectomy.
Blimey.
Again, as revenge.
Huh.
To essentially say, you loved my breasts so much, I'm going to get you back. So these are dark kind of novels, and they're, she was going to a pretty disturbing place, and I think they're fascinating. All of them, you're reading along, you go, whoa. I mean, really some shocking scenes in there.
Those
Completely
editions look
disappeared,
sort of
but
early. I was going to say they look sort of early 80s. When were the books published?
yeah, let's see. No Mama No, I want to say was 78.
Okay.
Yeah, she wrote them in rapids 78, 79, and 81.
Wow.
So they all came out on hardback. I just happened to have picked these up in the UK when I started looking for her stuff. Yeah, it's a shame. I'd love to see. I was looking at bringing out No Mama No, which I think is the most solid of the three. But we'll see. One day someone will come up with the geld to
I can I can imagine why her sons are a little ambivalent about these books coming out without a big payday, because boy, they do not sound like really happy families at all.
apparently she's much better known as a playwright, and in fact she endowed an annual award for young playwrights, and so many budding young playwrights in the UK have benefited from getting a Verity Bargate award. But the novels have just gone. I mean, hardly anybody, even geeky people like me who are going back into old books. I don't find anything about these. So they
Never
were
heard of
published,
her.
all three were published
Ever.
in the US.
No.
Well, I think two out of three were published in the US. So interesting books. I mean, I still think about them just because they pull you into a mindset. Each kind of narrator or each protagonist pulls you into her way of looking at the world, and she does it very convincingly. So I was fascinating to read. Anyone else? Gordon, what have you been reading?
I was thinking about this. Oh no, I'm about to get asked to feed a cat. Um, it's the 5th now in the Darkland Tales series from Polygon Books in Scotland. One I wanted to love, but also something of a little bit of a disappointment, but more because of its form as a novella. I don't know, it seemed like I've lost the screen. The problem that I had with it is that the present part, which is what happens to Grouch in a period of time after Macbeth is killed, that's not known in history. So actually creating a narrative and I'm trying to think how I would put it, creating that narrative so that you get an idea of what may have happened or afterwards, that part was excellent. And a few characters that came as part of there really enjoyed that. But it's the bit where she goes back to how Grouch and Macbeth met, came together, and then trying to compress a very short précis of the 17-year reign that Macbeth was king. It was too quick and too jagged for a novella, and there were occasional moments where, although Val McDermott has said she tried to ignore Shakespeare, I can pick the parts where she tried to say, no, this is what happened, not this. And I wish she'd sort of just totally ignored that and went off on the story, because I've got the link, which I'll post later. There's actually quite a good article that Dorothy Dunnett wrote many, many, many years ago that picks a lot of holes in what Shakespeare did, and pointing out that you've got this part of the Macbeth story. The bit about killing the king was from something that happened a couple of 100 years earlier, and that was all in Holinshed. So it's what he pulled together for the story. A little bit about historical characters who, one was a moneylender and probably a descendant of James I of England, of James V of Scotland. Well, they didn't want a moneylender in their history, because that just wasn't the done thing in that time.
Right.
It was just convenient for Banquo to be created and for him to possibly be a descendant. So very political. So yeah, I did want to enjoy it. It is much better. There's a few other books. Dorothy Dunnett's The King Hereafter, which is a doorstop at 800 pages, goes off on a theory that she likes, and it is an interesting read. The one from many years ago was Nigel Tranter's Macbeth, was where I first became aware that Shakespeare was probably a destruction of history. Reread it again a few years ago, and goodness, I'd forgotten how clunky it was. His prose is not the best, but it's still worth a look. And the Darkland Tales series themselves, Hex is wonderful, the second one that Jenny Fagan wrote. Rizzio by Denise Mina, the first, is quite good. And in particular, the fourth, which is almost like a buddy movie in a way, of a Viking and a priest left on Iona, and how the two of them come together, and then also a woman they're the three people left on the island at one point. And those three in particular of the Darkland Tales series, I would definitely recommend. But yeah, as novellas, they're still worth looking at, and do hope they keep going. And I better go and give someone some food.
Yeah.
I knew she'd do this.
Anybody else want to share something they found good for the month? If not, let's jump into snow country. So James, why? I guess there were a number of Japanese novels on the long list, so to speak. What led you to hone in on this one?
I think, well, partly because I think, I mean, certainly older, sort of when Japanese fiction started being translated into English, kind of on a larger scale, the big three writers were Kawabata, Tanizaki, and Mishima, and all of whom are great writers. I have to say, I like Kawabata and Tanizaki more because they're all odd. They're humanly odd, whereas Mishima is demented. But I don't know, this, even in this book where for the most part not much happens, objectively speaking, it's really just for the most part a man wandering around a bit, sitting in a room while a woman rushes in and out and says surprising things and sometimes sleeps with him and sometimes rushes off. You absolutely, at any moment, even though I've read it before, I could not predict what on earth was going to happen next. It's not that the characters are unbelievable, it's just that their motivations are quite obscure. I mean, even the central character, he's quite a blank space. Like, you get much more of an idea of his aesthetic interests than you do of his life or his feelings about anything. And you get a long period at the start where he's looking at the reflection of Yoko in the window in the train, and you get much more time spent on that, for example, than what he feels really about anything. And Komiko, for example, you only see from the outside, and she's quite volatile, so you don't get a kind of a fixed idea of what she's like as a person. It's only a year into their relationship as such that you learn that she's actually got not exactly a fiance, but a man that she's with who's sort of, I guess, the equivalent of a fiance who she doesn't even like.
Right.
But yeah, her life he's not, I guess, interested enough to draw the details out of her. And so you only get it in bits and pieces. It's such an odd and elusive book. And it feels much bigger than its size. I mean, in some ways, I think probably Kawabata's best writing are his short stories, but this, I think, has the virtues of his short stories in a slightly longer form. I mean, I remember you were saying last time the history of this book is so odd, and I was looking it up, and yeah, it was written over such an enormous period of time. And revised.
I mean, it was like 15, 20 years as first short stories, and then he kind of came back and decided to glue it together into a novel. And there are essentially 3 episodes, although we kind of, I guess we start in the 3rd season and then go back to the 1st season, or and then to the 2nd visit, and then finally the 3rd visit again. It's done very, I mean, I didn't even catch the time shift the first time I read it until wait, okay, that it was fall, and now it's,
yes, it slips back almost without letting you know. It's just like in 1 or 2 words you realize if you go back and look that you've fallen backwards. But it's so seamless, and it's just, it has both a quite an overtly soothing but underneath quite an unsettling atmosphere to it. I think there are a lot of subtleties probably lost on me as a non-Japanese reader, and also I suspect just the era. I mean, it's a hard book to pin down when it's set. I think perhaps because of the long time it was written over, because it has bits of what feel like quite pre-World War II, but also quite post-World War II Japan.
It's definitely pre-World War II in the sense that there is not, I mean, you get no idea of the militarism going on in Japan, and nor of any destruction. So they would have been, I mean, I think there would have been some mention of the effects of the war. So this is, to me, I see this as probably late 20s, early 30s ish time frame.
Yes, but then
Partly
occasionally it's
I
like,
guess one of the is that the province in which it is set actually changed its name. So although he doesn't mention it, but the province at the time was known as Echigo, and now it's, I guess, called Nagata. But yeah, that's so yeah. I mean, it is. I am assuming it's in the 30s time frame. So
which
pre
makes sense because
war.
there's no kind of there's like hints of non-Japanese technology, but there's nobody who's a sort of a non-Japanese character. There's no, there's no foreigners in the background even, so that would make
Yeah,
sense.
right.
So yeah, but yeah, so it's just I like it. I couldn't even, as I say, it's hard to describe quite how I like it. It's quite an odd and obtuse book in many ways, but I don't know, nothing else. It's probably one of those books where the atmosphere kind of clings to you a lot longer than normal after you've finished reading it. I mean, I don't even fully understand. For example, he ruins the relationship between them really at one point by referring to her as a woman rather than a girl. And
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
even fully
I was going
understand
to
why.
ask, does anybody know? Because there's that little, twice he calls her a good girl, and then he calls her a good woman, and she flares up at that. And I mean, I read several kind of scholarly articles about Snow Country to try to understand it, and neither one of them mentions that at all. And yet it seems to be kind of like the other than the fire right at the end, it seems to be like the dramatic high point in the narrative.
That's it. And I did the same, and I found something basically saying, yes, so if you know Japanese culture, you'll understand why this is so important, and then moves on without saying, but if you don't know Japanese culture, this is why it's so important. So it wasn't very helpful, but yeah.
So other than the fact that if you know Japanese and culture, you'd understand. Yeah. Well, apparently one of the things, let's see, so one of the articles I found, this is by a woman, actually went back and Gwen Boardman, subsequent to this article, she wrote a book about Kawabata and Tanizaki. But she says, specifically about Komako, it says, well, on the surface, Soap Country is the story of this dilettante, plump, sort of lazy, in fact, very hands-off. It would specifically mention that he stopped studying Japanese dance kind of because he'd actually have to be in contact with it. So he's studying ballet, but he, doesn't want to actually
He's never
go
seen
see
one.
ballet.
Yeah.
But he wants to write a book, but he realizes nobody's going to read it. So he says, the dilettante is visiting his mountain geisha. She is a hot spring geisha for the Japanese, essentially a vulgar one-nighter, not to be confused with the respected and skilled professionals of Kyoto, Tokyo, and Osaka. Shimamura continually sees her as exquisitely clean, which is I mean, I am not into this whole geisha thing. And so that was a little bit uncomfortable for me. But exquisitely clean, and she points out a parallel between Komako's cleanliness and the fact of the cleaning of the shijimis, which is this sort of crepey material that they make in that part of the world. Very labor intensive, very expensive.
Oh, and the sun bleaching and
right, the sun
snow
bleaching,
bleaching, I mean.
right.
Yeah.
And so it may be related to that essentially he's like teasing her that she is not, I mean, you're a good woman may be a reference to like, well, you're a Tokyo class geisha, which she knows is not true at all. I mean, the whole business about, is she an officially certified geisha or she's just much of that.
Exactly. I mean, I just do not understand, nor do I think I could ever understand all the subtleties of that. I mean, it's such a foreign aspect of life to a Westerner to begin with, and this does bring up a whole lot of extra levels that certainly I couldn't even begin to comprehend. But having said that, even without fully understanding that, I don't think that's to the detriment of enjoying the book, because it's
No.
the important thing is that she reacts that way, not necessarily why she reacts that way, and the way it then undoes whatever peculiar relationship they have going on between them.
Yeah, you know,
So
he's
yeah,
never
no,
he's never coming back to that place for sure.
no,
And he's never
exactly.
gonna come back and see her.
That's it. And the way, because again, the big dramatic ending with the fire and Yoko's presumed death in another book, that would be significant because he would have been, secretly having an affair with Yoko, or there would have been some connection, but there is really no connection between them except that he's seen her a few times and Yoko has talked to him a couple of times.
He loves the
But
sound of her voice.
exactly, but there's no relationship there between them. There's no jealousy really between the two women either, that you might expect to be stirred up in a different kind of book. So it never does the expected thing, which is always admirable, but it avoids doing the expected thing without becoming ludicrous in the process, which is much harder to do.
Right. Well, one of the other things I wanted to mention from Boardman's article, that because she points out numerous ways in which essentially, if you're not Japanese, you don't get what's going on. That Kawabata has many of his terms have evocations that a Japanese would get, and Westerners. So she says, she talks about a number of things about like the looking in the glass and seeing it as a mirror, and the mirror theme happening in the book. And she says, so much the Western reader can perceive, but he's apt to miss the subliminal hints of the season words that are so much a part of Japanese fabric. For instance, the quality of Shimamura's first encounter with Komako is rendered in a flashback of spring imagery. So that first the first scene is he's coming in the snow season, in the winter, and he sees her in the train station. And then he has this flashback to the spring, and he says their relationship, or she says, their relationship is made delicately clear as two yellow butterflies skim across the scene in a rare moment when Shimamura goes running and laughing down the mountainside. Such butterflies flash in and out of centuries of springtime verses in Japanese literature, but they are also traditionally referred to as ichi nichi no tsuma, one-day spouses, and essentially saying that's a kind of a crude way of referring to geisha, is a one-night stand girl. So I mean,
It's
yeah,
interesting because I assume everyone's reading the Seidensticker translation. I think that's the only
has
one.
there been another one?
Yeah, I don't think so. But it's interesting how I think it, there's a footnote to tell you about the kind of hand and foot warmers. I think there's one other footnote, but it's quite it does leave you a lot to work out for yourself that you would never pick up without I suspect, unless you already spoke Japanese, a lot of this context you would never know. So it's quite interesting. But again, it's also interesting that the book works despite not having that context. So
yeah, it would be interesting to read another translation, I think, particularly with somebody who would take the time to sort of annotate or comment a little bit more than Seidensticker did.
well, that's because this is what, a 70-year-old translation almost now.
Yeah,
So.
my gosh. It's, I mean, this is 57. So yeah, I mean, 60, 56. Yeah.
And it is possible to get a new one because for a long time there were only a handful of Kawabata books available, and now suddenly several more have come into English just in the last year or two. So I don't know whether that means this is a bit of a revived attempt to bring his work back to English speaking attention, which might mean we get some new versions of the older ones. I'm not sure, but anything more is welcome. So
Any other other reactions to? I mean, you definitely feel immersed in Japanese culture because there's no acknowledgement of the Western world in a sense of okay, trains, they got their trains maybe, but you know, this is still an isolated culture, I would say, and particularly going up to the snow country, being a place that's, you know, is not, I mean, it's touristy, it's a ski area, but not, you know, it's not, they're still doing traditional craft making, they're still raising rice, they're still making silk. So it's, you know, it's not, it's, if you were going to picture the Japanese culture in somewhat modern but still quite isolation, this is a good way to do that in 100 and whatever it is, 142 pages in my paperback edition.
And Shimamura too, because when he's up there, he doesn't even associate with the other tourists, so he's even more isolated than, you know, because she Komako will come back and report, you know, she's bad at this party or with this gathering. She'll come back and tell him about it, but he has no association. You know, he basically, I think he goes out once or twice and wanders around and talks to maybe one or two people, but for the most part, he's not even, in contact with the other tourists in the remote area. So,
right.
But it's also, you could pick up towards the end that he's well known by the locals. The taxi driver knows who he is and who they are. Or there's rumors or other things sort of just mentioned as an aside or as a, just in passing. There was another aspect that was interesting going back to Geisha, that she had to pay the establishment that he was in, or the guest house, for the time that she was there.
Mm-hmm.
There's that part where the hours were being calculated and maybe there was a discount given, or it just seemed an unusual thing.
Yes, this weird sort of indentured aspect to it beyond the other peculiarities of it.
Yeah, well, it gives you a sense of the economy around, let's not say prostitution, but, you know, geishaism, but essentially prostitution. So she's working, when Kamako is working, she's working with the candy store owner, so he's getting a cut. The hotel owner gets a cut every time she's having a visit with a client, and it's a time-based thing.
And presumably the family, that house they creep through where she's staying at one point with all the family sleeping on the floor, presumably there's a financial aspect of it for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's getting, you know, she's getting a room, and the guy, and it's not just rent, I assume. So he's like the handler or the pimp, as we might call it in a cruder sense. But how all that works, I mean, I mean, at least from Boardman's article, it is, you know, in that area, it is much more women for hire. And I guess it's a relatively small place, 12 geishas, they all know each other. So yeah, you have to assume it's a relatively small ski resort town. And his coming back 3 times in the space of less than, well, I guess a year-ish, I guess is part of what he stands out from that standpoint.
And her simultaneous desire to not be seen leaving his room with being in there while people keep popping their heads in and talking to them. Which this sort of makes
the little kid,
yeah, exactly,
knows everything that's going on.
Yeah, okay. This odd sort of pretense at everything being above board when everyone actually does know what's going on, but then that pretense seems odd when the geisha life is a absolutely normal part of the local culture too.
Yeah.
So it's not
Yeah.
it's a hidden prostitution thing. It's a it's an overt part of what people are coming there for, and everyone knows it. So
You come for the skiing, the hot baths, and the geishas.
yeah, exactly.
It's the
So it's a
three.
lot of
I
these
mean,
these very strange subtleties, which without fully understanding, do definitely add to this peculiar atmosphere, which I enjoyed. So I think partly sometimes reading this or reading like a Ismail Kadir book, as peculiarities of Albanian culture, I think I get the same odd kick from them that I do from some science fiction books. It's just being immersed in this peculiar culture that you don't have the reference points for, but it's all internally coherent. You just have to kind of feel your way through it.
right. That's a great analogy, actually. Yeah. Yeah. Some of Stanislav Lem's books are like that. Like Solaris is
Yes,
very much like that. I don't, it all makes sense, but we're just too stupid to understand
that's it.
why.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Julia, do you have any comments that you want to make? Or we've had three guys talking about this.
I'm going to go back to what we were saying about the good girl, good woman thing, because reading this from my perspective, it felt, even though I don't speak Japanese, it felt pretty clear to me that he was sort of, what does she bring to, what's her currency? It's her youth and her simplicity, her cleanness, all the things he talks about, her purity.
Mm.
And by saying you're a good woman, he just suddenly devalues what she has to offer. You're a grown up. You're no longer part of this idol. I've lost interest in this
Oh,
fantasy
geez.
of youth and simplicity that we're acting out here. And I can see, that was how I read that. And that he had then kind of displaced that onto Yoko, who he knew nothing about and had only exchanged, as you said earlier, a few conversations with. And it's a really sad book to me. I read this years ago when I was taking a course on Japanese history and not in the intervening time until last week. It's a really sad book, not just,
Yeah.
because sad things happen, but the level of limitation that each person is laboring under is so heavy. This whole thing with the fiance, maybe of both of the women, and then having to pay the medical debts, and it's crushing in like a Thomas Hardy way. It's really grim, and then contrasted with this beautiful nature and these lovely haiku-like descriptions. It really sank into me this time.
That's an interesting observation. Yeah, you could say it's sort of, almost like an Antonioni film. A lot of staring and
I did wonder too, actually, because as you're talking about the kind of losing her youth, because she's referred to at one point, I think, as being 18 or 19. And I did wonder too, if that's a direct translation from the Japanese, that makes her a year younger, really, which means she could only be 17 or 18, and she's already, had been in this relationship for 2 years, and another relationship, before that, and then you've got Yoko, who's younger even, and is already kind of caught up in this other relationship with the dying man, and it's just, these are these are very young. Yeah, they're girls. They're not women yet.
yeah,
They are.
yeah. Well, they
They're girls. And
literally are girls, and then again, you have to say, okay. I mean, it's a cultural thing. I know that. But I don't know. I'm never quite comfortable with well, things were different in those days.
yeah,
Okay, when everybody else in your whole culture is going in that direction, and girls are becoming geishas at the age of 16 or something like that, well, I guess that's the way it is. But yeah, the age is definitely yeah, there's no way she's past 19 based on
mm.
what's literally said in the book. And that it did kind of, how would you draw her timeline? Okay, well, she was in Tokyo with an older man, but he died, and he was setting her up as, so what was, like 15?
Yeah,
But even in the village thing, she was comment about the other geishas, and there were the older ones and there were younger ones. That meant younger than her. So who were they? And then that puts them in the age of 15, 16. It sort
Yeah,
of happens
true.
again.
And she just at 18 or whatever, as we were saying, she's she's seen as being at the peak, and probably it's all downhill from here, and that's terrifying.
And then
Yeah, I
there's
mean I mean I have to. This is one of those books where I really wanted to know. Well, I felt a little bit angry of saying you just, that's the end of the story, and we're left wondering what happens with the rest of her life.
Mm.
What's she gonna go down to the coast and is she gonna get married to this guy that she doesn't seem particularly
Yeah, the guy off
interested in,
screen
but
she
has a
doesn't like.
connection to?
Yeah.
He's gonna go back to Tokyo and have a nice, comfortable life and continue to be a dilettante. And I think, that I just found that kind of strange. Yeah, but that's probably a Western perspective and a 21st century as opposed to a 1930s, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these things about getting into the mindset of the past there are some challenges that present themselves for that sort of thing.
But if you look at it in conjunction with Death in Venice, for example, there's some of the same kind of, oh, here I am, a wealthy traveler. I see, a very young person, even younger in that case, and all of this stuff that I am going to make up a story about on them. And so I don't know. I don't know that it's specifically Japanese in the way it's expressed, but I think it's a pretty common story in a lot of cultures that these very, I was also thinking of the man without qualities too. The Shimamura is such a cipher. He exists only to sort of, vampire onto other things, and kind of suck whatever he can out of them and then wander away. So yeah,
it's interesting. Yeah, it's funny. I actually read. So I think last month I read "Love and Death on Long Island" by Gilbert Adair, which is terrific. Very much a take on the Death in Venice theme, but much funnier. But Adair also wrote a book called The Real Tadzio, which is a very slim book, which is about the real. So Thomas Mann did actually see a Polish family with a very beautiful young boy when he was with his family in Venice, and apparently actually had such a strong reaction to like, we need to get out of here now, which he said was because the malaria was ripping through Venice at the time. But Adair is saying, essentially he was saying, well, my gaydar is firing off a little bit too hard here, so I've got to get myself out of here. But anyway, it was essentially a very brief biography of the actual Polish boy and his life, and he was sort of in an aristocracy in Poland, and so of course went into the army, had a terrible time as a prisoner of war. Then was sort of persecuted under the communists, and then very late in life kind of started to be able to enjoy some things that were not miserable. So not necessarily a really dramatically interesting story, but yeah, apparently Death in Venice has, some strong factual basis that inspired Mann. So he got away from there, but he then kind of like channeled his feelings through that, amazing story. So I am not going to resist the temptation to say how much I want to plug next month's book. So this one, this is a Valancourt edition, which is 127 pages. I have so many copies of this book because I've given it away probably at least a dozen times. So I have like 2 first editions. I have a proof copy of it, several American paperbacks, and this is the most recent. In the US, this is what's in print today. So Sweet Dreams, we'll talk about it next month, but it is my absolute favorite novel. The prose in this book is so perfect. It's some of the most, in my opinion, it's some of the most perfect English prose. And I guess what I mean by that is there's not one unnecessary. I mean, there's some paragraphs in there. I think you'll just, if you haven't read it before, I think there's some paragraphs in there where you'll just go, that's just so well said. And so that's one of the things when the situations are great. It's satirical without punching anybody in the face. You get to meet God. You get to experience what one heaven is like, and it's a great version of heaven. You can fly if you feel like flying, but if you don't have to fly, you don't fly. And actually, the longer you stay, it kind of becomes uncool to keep flying. It was just there's this wonderful scenes, and I love it, and it's full of gentle human comedy without being saccharine at all. There's nothing saccharine about this book. It is essentially a book about how humans can never stop being human, no matter what the situation. And very much a parody of what English liberal culture in the late 60s was like, which Frayne has written numerous plays about that. The Benefactors is sort of, you could take characters out of the Benefactors and put them in this book and vice versa. So anyway, I'm eager to see if you haven't read it before, I'm eager to hear what folks think, because I just love this book so much. I have certainly read this 7 or 8 times at least, which I don't reread hardly anything. So it's got to be an exceptional book. It's my comfort book, I guess you would say. Okay, any other comments that folks want to make? Well, thanks. And James, thank you for taking us to Japan with
Your slightly
Mr.
mystified guy.
Kawabata. And actually, I will send out a link. I just found just this afternoon. You can probably find it on YouTube yourself, but if you search for Mishima Kawabata, the 2 of them appeared on Japanese television with subtitles of their discussion. Apparently was done for Canadian TV in the late 60s. Before Kawabata died, before Mishima killed himself, and the 2 of them have a conversation about their literature, and it's only like 35 minutes long, so it's pretty interesting. I meant to send it out with the invitation, but I just found it too soon to do that. But so yeah, I mean, if they're linger, I mean, I think I will. I told Gordon I thought this would probably be my only Kawabata, but after the discussion, I may go back and look at the Thousand Cranes.
If you want to read something, there's books of his short stories might be the way to go, because they're
That's
so
a good
condensed
recommendation
and so good. I think that there's the House of Sleeping Beauties and Palm of the Hand stories, collections like that. So yeah,
okay.
that might be the way to go next if you're still slightly Kawabata curious. So
I feel like that belongs on a t-shirt.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm Kawabata curious. Okay, doke. Well, thanks, folks. It's good to see you again, and we'll see you in June. And if you don't love Sweet Dreams, I will still respect you, but it will hurt my feelings
Yeah.
greatly.
You'll be out of the wheel.